From San Francisco, California, Jeremy.
THQ is back again with its yearly installment of Smackdown with Smackdown vs. Raw 2007. And as is the norm, it's still an impressive combination of wrestling, storytelling, and user customization.
Well, that's very generous.
Of course, like every year before it, it offers a number of new gameplay additions, as well as a couple of features, and yes, it is still one of the better-looking combat games around. But there's an issue here, and that's that after 8 straight years of a similar thing, the presentational formula hasn't evolved enough to feel as fresh as it used to. We'll talk more about that a little later. First, let's talk about what SmackDown does right, and that includes a lot. Let's begin with the control scheme, which is the first and most obvious difference between this year's title and those that came before it. Wrestler control has now been moved to the right analog stick instead of the face buttons, and though there is a definite learning curve, the new system is more responsive and fun than it was with the old way. There's also a new ultimate control move that basically works with the R3 button. These moves add direct player manipulation to the action, so even though you can't do everything with them, you can still control the speed and frequency of certain maneuvers. Stuff like power slams, ZDTs, power bombs, suplexes, moves like that. The only downside to these maneuvers is that they aren't always balanced properly. They sap your stamina dry after about 3 or 4 groin on the ring pushes, and if you do 3 or 4 repeating power bombs, which is a tougher move by the way, it doesn't have as much effect on your bar, so it's a little unbalanced there. Of course, the most entertaining and addictive new feature for SmackDown is the inclusion of environmental hotspots. These little sequences really capture the feeling of the WWE's more brutal matchups, and they're definitely fun to play too. Plus, not only do these environmental interactions allow users to throw opponents into speakers and strangle them with cords and hit them with television sets, but they can also smash your heads into staircases or grab a fan sign and build heat or send an opponent flying through the Spanish announcer's table, which is a personal favorite of mine.
Oh boy, the adrenaline is pumping.
Another fix this year is a more realistic season mode. This time there are more than 40 original storylines with beginnings, endings, and even branching paths. It's also fully voiced, and it offers a few character-specific storylines, plus a customizable 3D locker room where you can view your trophies and other goodies. There are also improvements to General Manager mode, which builds on the same foundations that powered last year's game, but now you can hire writers for better storylines, or you can send superstars to heat and velocity to make them more popular for the bigger shows, and gain access to the Power 25, that's the same ranking list that they have on WWE.com. Now, besides everything I've already talked about, there are plenty of other little fixes and bonuses worth mentioning too. There's now an endless reversal system, and there's additional creator-player parts. You can now stylize your characters to be a little bit more personal. And of course, they've added fixes to the table match, and the much-anticipated Money in the Bank has finally been thrown in. So with all the positives that I've touched on, where are the valid criticisms? Well, I think the most obvious place to start is with the animations. Despite having a number of new moves and ring walks, the vast majority of SmackDown's moveset feels a little bit too familiar. In fact, it feels a lot like it did 8 years ago, and that includes the 360 version. Also, despite the move from keyframe to motion capture over time, a strong portion of the maneuvers here still feel like they're 2 or 3 generations old, and they require you to wait most of the time to have to finish playing out before you can actually do anything again. It can get really frustrating when you're waiting for someone to stop selling the fact that they get hurt before you can hit the other guy back. The roster's a little outdated too, and it is missing some of the key guys, particularly in the tag team division, you know, guys like Brian Kendrick and Paul London and the Spirit Squad. The worst culprit, though, are the load times. From start to finish, I'm not kidding, SmackDown loads slower and more often than a terrified Civil War soldier. Almost every screen in the game loads in upwards of 10 to 20 seconds every time it's selected, and there's even instances where, this is the absolute truth, it loads another loading screen. Amazingly, the 360 version doesn't have any real advantages over the PS2 version either, so when you couple that with the non-aggressive AI from the past couple of years, you can understand why the game feels a little bit dated. But the real question is, do these problems actually make SmackDown a bad game? Of course not. No sports or fighting titles ever without its problems. But given the current state of video games and the continued progress that developers are making with AI and downloadable content and animation routines, especially on the next generation level, the game's lacking in those areas definitely shows you that it's in need of an overhaul. Even so, WWE SmackDown vs. Raw 2007 is still a beast of a wrestling game. Regardless of its dated issues, it's still a heck of a lot of fun. There are thousands of different grappling holds to play around with, and the new analog-based focus adds flair to an established control setup. Oh, and before I forget, if you're trying to figure out which version to get if you own both the PS2 and 360 systems, go with Xbox. It supports widescreen, it has higher resolutions, you can get achievements, and it uses realistic sweat effects. Yeah, sweat.
Not be king. These are some of the finest athletes in all of sports entertainment.
I know that, JR. I'm just saying that this has been a great match so far.
It has